Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to another Level Up Hour. I am Chris Short, host, showrunner, producer, whatever you want to call me. I will probably answer to it. I am joined by the one and only, the illustrious Langdon White, and a special guest today who we will let her introduce herself here in a moment. Langdon, you want to kick off what we're talking about and everything today?
Yeah, so as always, I'm Langdon White, and this is the Level Up Hour, where we talk about, generally speaking, we talk about containers and why they're interesting and why they can be interesting to you as like a system administrator or a developer, just kind of in your like everyday workflow. Not to mention kind of all the hype is right around like using them in production, that kind of thing. But I think a lot of people who have been adopting containers use them all the time. And so we talk about all those different kinds of usages, but then we kind of talk about other things as well. And today is one of the more other things discussions where we'll be talking a bit about security, but I will share my awesome slides that everyone I know loves, not only because they're slides,
yes,
but also they're the best slides. So the Level Up Hour, as always, you can find us on Twitter at Langdon with a 1 and Chris Short with an O. I need to figure out some edit on it every time I say it, just for the entertainment value.
O. When would Short not have an O?
I don't know. Sometimes. So you can also talk to us on our Discord, and it's the link is there, and I'm sure that Chris will put it in the chat as well.
Right there. Ta-da.
And so today we're going to be talking about some newish buzzwords. DevSecOps has actually been around for a while now, I think, and then Shift Left is
even longer,
newer.
Yeah.
Maybe. Actually, I would say I would say it's more recent than DevSecOps, but whatever. Really? We'll get into that. Okay. We can fight. But as you notice, exactly. As you notice, it says part 1. And the reason it says part 1 is not because we're going to do a part 2 on this show, but we're going to do a part 2 on another show called In the Clouds, which I want to say is in a couple or 3 weeks. I had meant to look up the date and then I forgot. So
I think it's next week.
The 29th, right?
There it is.
Yes,
Okay, the 29th. So
just
watch the channel all the time between now and then, and you won't miss it.
That's the best advice.
Right, exactly. So and Kirsten will be back on that show to talk about the same subject, maybe from a slightly different perspective. And then, as always, show notes from last time we have on the GitHub repo was episode 40, where we talked about serverless and why you want some serverless servers, but we won't get into the jokes we can make there. And that, for now, is the end of our slides.
All right.
So, Kirsten, we like everyone who, especially who works at Red Hat, to when they come on the show, to introduce themselves, primarily because, as we were talking a little bit before the show, we do enough reorgs and like group change stuff like that we're never quite sure what your title or who you work for is. So it's so much easier.
We just know you're awesome. That's all
right.
we know.
We know you, and so we like you to, kind of give us a little introduction of who you are and what you do.
Sure. So Kirsten Newcomer, Director of Cloud Security Strategy for the Cloud Platforms team. As Landon said, we did have a recent reorg, so I'm still learning the names of the business unit. That doesn't really matter. I still do what I've been doing pretty much since I joined Red Hat about 5 years ago, which is to focus on security for containers and Kubernetes. That's kind of throughout the stack. I work with a whole bunch of other security experts throughout Red Hat, interact with the OpenShift PM team, with the engineering team, spend a lot of time with our customers, talking about security and how to help them meet their security goals with OpenShift. So
cool. All right. So, I have a relatively long running joke of, I come from a development background, so security. But I also I really still need to get one of those T-shirts that says an angel loses its wings every time you set and force 0. But so I'm much better now. I use SE Linux on a regular basis. Sometimes I run into problems or whatever, and I'll turn it off. But then I will actually figure out why I had to turn it off, fix that thing, and then turn it back on again. So let's kind of talk about it from a little bit of the perspective of containers versus other kinds of kind of deployment styles. What would you say is the biggest difference between security in this kind of cloud native-y world versus security on a traditional virtual machine?
Yep. Really, one of the things I'm fond of saying is that containers and Kubernetes really require DevSecOps. And let me explain two things. What is DevSecOps and why do I say that? So first of all, DevSecOps, people are probably familiar with the term DevOps, right? Kind of a tighter integration of development and operations in order to make it easy for developers to build and deploy their solutions in an automated fashion, in an agile fashion, quickly, kind of get their code out to their end user easily and quickly without kind of going through a whole bunch of manual gates with operations, right? CI and CD, right? Continuous integration, continuous deployment, key parts of DevOps. When the DevOps kind of framework was initially touted and kind of promoted, it was always intended to include security gates. And kind of the concept being that you need to think about security throughout that CI/CD process. Security should not be an afterthought. It's not the responsibility of the security team just for operations. It really should be integrated throughout that DevOps lifecycle, but people forgot. And some of the reason people forgot really is that, historically teams have been siloed. There's been the development team, the operations team, the security team, DevOps. People heard that. They said, oh, we'll connect the development and the operations team. They didn't always remember to think about integrating security. For folks who haven't seen it, DevOps shows up as this infinity loop, right? There are different stages in it, but it's really intended to be a closed loop because you're not just done once you've deployed. You may find issues during a production environment that then need to be fed back to the development team so that those issues can be addressed and you restart that cycle again. So the reason that I see DevSecOps as so crucial for containers is that containers are designed to carry all of the system dependencies, the runtime dependencies with the application code. And especially in a Kubernetes environment, you're always deploying from a container image. That image is immutable unless it's rebuilt, right? So when a problem shows up in production, and again, let's say we're using Kubernetes, we said I want 3 instances of my web front end to be running. As soon as one of those instances goes down, Kubernetes is going to notice and it's going to redeploy another one from the container image. If a new CVE is discovered in the code in that image and you step into a running container and fix it there, you lose your fix as soon as the redeployment happens. Right? So best practice, never patch a running container, always rebuild and redeploy. So that really just means you need that infinity loop. You need DevSecOps.
Right. Well, and the infinity loop needs to include security in it.
Yes.
It's not just like a break in the loop somewhere.
Yeah. It's not like a touch point where physical humans come in and tell you, hey, here's a stack of papers that you need to fix. Yes.
Right. So just kind of by way of background, at least for me, I don't know how pervasive the term CVE has gotten. I think it's gotten pretty pervasive. But basically a CVE, common vulnerability,
enumeration.
Yeah. So basically it's a label of all the big, bad, ugly bugs that we discover on the internet, right? So, or in anywhere kind of in software. And so it's gotten to shorten to CVE, but if you think about it in terms of this is a kind of a known bug to the industry. And hopefully there's also a patch that's available for said CVE, but not always, right? So just like I said, by way of context, to your point though, is that even if, whenever a CVE comes out or whenever an issue comes out, when the patch becomes available, that does not mean that you should go and slap that into your production environment if you're thinking about containers, right? You should be, as I like to say, one of the hallmarks of like an SRE or a DevOps environment is you fix the recipe, not the cake, right? So when you make a really bad cake, you can sometimes fix it with frosting, but as long as it's not the flavor, but the look of it, I kind of mean. But you're better off if next time you actually remember to grease the pan, right? You fix the recipe so that you can make the next cake a little bit better without having to cover it up with frosting. So in kind of the same way, you want to introduce those patches into your container environment, and preferably with a fair amount of testing. That's where we get into that continuous integration side of it, so that that you don't have a developer who took advantage of a bug and did some sort of workaround or had some sort of cheat code that allowed them to solve some problem and doesn't introduce a new security vulnerability. So there's all these things to think about, but the point being is that you want to bring those patches, those fixes, those problems into the base of your deployment environment so that you can roll that out. So basically, I think what you're saying when you say DevSecOps, right, is that it's a first-class citizen, right? In that you want it in the catch phrase, right, so that it's considered just a part of doing business. It's not, something that is added onto the side. I would very much in a lot of ways like to see it be, DevSecQE ops. But that's, it doesn't quite roll.
You're going to make me pull out a tweet that was really funny last week.
Oh dear.
Okay. Yeah. So this other term, which I certainly haven't heard as much. Maybe it's older and it just hasn't crossed my path as much. But so what's this idea of shift left?
Yeah, so shift left is absolutely tied to DevSecOps. It's all about ensuring that you think about security as early in the life cycle as possible, right? So that infinity loop is typically made up of stages that include, design, develop, CI, which should include test, CD, operations, et cetera. There's a whole set of stages. So oftentimes kind of with traditional architectures, what would happen is the developers would work on their code. They'd get it ready to release. It'd be ready for deployment. And the security team would run an analysis on it. And then they'd feed back this huge list of unprioritized information back to the development team. And the dev team might have been working for 3 months and suddenly, right, they're stopped in their tracks. They can't get their code deployed until they address these vulnerabilities. So shifting left in that life cycle, if instead of taking, and the left-hand side of that infinity loop typically is that development side, and the right-hand side of the infinity loop tends to be the operations side. And so shifting left means we're going to move our security analysis as early into that life cycle as possible. And we're going to use automated tools that can provide information to the developers in a way that they can consume easily and respond to easily without having to have that separate step just before you deploy of another team kind of doing this analysis and then throwing the information over the wall. So I want tools integrated into my security tools, integrated into my CI process, but maybe not just my CI process. In fact, Red Hat offers IDE plugins that do security and dependency analysis right in the IDE. So the developer gets data about whether there are known vulnerabilities in their source code right at the beginning, right? You want to do this as early as possible and empower the development team to take action with good information.
Well, and one of the things that I think is important and that you kind of alluded to that I want to kind of really call out, this is when I was doing waterfall development 20 years ago on particularly on Windows. Windows has always had a long habit of pushing updates automatically. And the problem as a developer is that it came in an uncontrolled way, right? So I would just turn off updates until I was ready for, quote unquote, patch day, right? So, if I was in the middle of a critical, development cycle, I would try to bottle all that up into one step towards the end where I could deal with all of those changes. Good and bad, right? So like, as in I could then contain the work into that sort of scenario, but it means that I may have a large volume of it. Especially now, we're getting so many attacks, right? We have so much code in place. I have my kind of running joke, my stupid HTML website's running on like at least 1 million lines of code, right? I didn't write any of it. But it's, there's a ton of code in there. There's tons of places for bugs. And so it's really important that even if we don't have a CI system or things like that, we need to be doing continuous integration all the time as developers, right? We need to know, hey, there's these vulnerabilities out there. We need to be incorporating those changes all the way along as we go. And actually that might be, because of testing, it might be because of security, it might be because of requirements change. There's lots of different reasons, but you continuously need to be reevaluating and looking at your code just as a human, right? Like not even in some sort of magical deployment environment.
No, absolutely. And honestly, as developers, you want that code to get out there so that your users have access, right? And so anything you can do to prevent roadblocks down the road is to your benefit, right? And it might mean you need to learn a couple of things. I mean, one of the things, so part of my history is I've worked on developer tools for many years prior to joining Red Hat, and prior to joining Black Duck before that, it was with Rational Software. And I watched the open source community take over the developer tools market, which has actually been a real win, right? So things like CVS as an open source code control system. Now everybody's using Git, right? But it's just been, there are a plethora of open source tools available to the developers. So if you're working in an environment where somebody isn't yet, you don't have easy access to a pipeline or something, go find one. Go play around with Tecton for containers. Use Claire for vulnerability scanning in your environment. Find some of these open source tools and incorporate them into what you're doing so that you've saved yourself the hassle of hearing down the road that something's not ready. Or if it's your own code, you're managing your own deployment, right? You don't want to deal with having to scramble at the last minute to address. Now, there's no way to predict all the vulnerabilities that we're going to be dealing with, right? New vulnerabilities are discovered in existing code all the time.
Yeah.
That's the other reason that automation is so important. Because you're going to need to respond to something at some point.
Right. And the thing, this is one of those, perfect is the enemy of the good. Things where you as an individual can make some of those pipelines for your own stuff without relying on, your infrastructure team or, your boss or whatever, where you can just incorporate some of these tools as you're pointing out, right? Like they're all open source, which means two things. One, they're continuously getting better, but they're also free. And so you can, aside from having to spend the time and the energy to set it up, while I would prefer my infrastructure team provide me this stuff kind of in a way that I can consume it as a developer or even as an administrator, I want to, I can still do it myself, right? I can still incorporate my own components. I just wanted to pause there briefly because, Chris, were there questions?
There are some questions. We have somebody that is very new to DevSecOps and is interested in what kinds of tools that people are using. I mean, we mentioned Claire, I already dropped the link to that in chat. But Kirsten, I don't want you to focus necessarily specifically on tools, but classes of tools. What would you recommend? Everybody needs in their DevSecOps pipeline?
Yep, great question. So there are a couple of things. Most people are familiar with vulnerability analysis. Oftentimes, it used to be that a lot of that analysis was focused on packages like jar files, et cetera. Now, of course, there are plenty, or binaries, there are plenty of scanners out there that will scan container images. When you're building a container, you always need a base image with your OS dependencies. So you still need a container image scanner, and that's one of the things Claire does, right? And so that's key. Another really good thing to look at is a static SAST, static analysis security tool, right? So this is something that's going to be run on your source code, and it's going to look for patterns of known coding practices or poor coding that can lead to vulnerabilities. So often the SAST tooling, like especially again, if we're talking web apps, there's something called the OWASP 10, which is the top 10 vulnerabilities that are known to be, or in this case, I'm not talking CVEs, but again, challenges with coding practices that can lead to vulnerabilities. Things like cross-site scripting. So you want a SAST tool that can look for those kinds of challenges. Those are kind of two of the key ones. One of the newer things to think about in a Kubernetes environment, again, you're not just deploying a container image, you have to have instructions to Kubernetes about how to manage that deployment. And that's called a deployment, or sometimes in OpenShift, a deployment config. You might have a Helm chart that you're using. You might have a Kubernetes operator. Those instructions should be analyzed as well. And so there are things there that's kind of an emerging space. So I call it app config analysis. It's newer, but there's something like KubeLinter, which is an open source project where you can assess what are the privilege requests that are being made in those deployments or those Helm charts. Are they appropriate for the environment? If you want to get, so those are kind of the three basics, right? Vulnerability and CVE analysis, or sometimes also called a software configuration analysis tool, a SAST tool for analyzing your code, and then analyzing your application config data. If you want to get fancier, there's dynamic application security testing, there's runtime application security testing, but I would start with those minimum three.
It's funny, you say three, but I managed to write out five.
That's because the last two,
so many layers, yeah.
DAST and RAST, right? Dynamic and runtime are things that I would consider. You can add them on after you've gotten comfortable with the first three.
Right. And I think like the OWASP top 10 is something that you continuously need to look at because it does get updated, right? Like, and these are the like top 10 most known bad security practices that are happening out in the world, and OWASP is trying to focus people to mitigate them. And their intention is to build every cycle of their top 10 on their security stacks of suggestions. So it's a great question. There's a lot of tooling that covers that entire space. I mean, I will link to the CNCF landscape. It'll give you an idea of the overwhelming amount of tooling that's out there. But that's basically the gist of what you need to be looking for.
I was going to also add there too, another way to think about it is like, there's kind of like looking at your code, like out from the outside, which is kind of the vulnerability analysis. There's kind of looking at the code from the inside, which is kind of static analysis. And then there's looking at the code from where it's going to run in production, which is the deployment configuration. And those three things are actually important in any development environment, right? Like whether you're using containers or not containers or whatever, it's the mechanics of how you do that, or where the stuff lives, or how many of the places can introduce new problems, which is the difference between doing that in bare metal or doing that in kind of containers. It's just in the Kubernetes environment, you get all these advantages about making sure that like things kind of like around uptime, right? The downside is that you need to be much more aware of the environment in which that container is playing in. So all the things around your code to be sure that you're not introducing holes there that that you wouldn't necessarily see on kind of a physical deployment or something.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick at that a little bit,
Okay.
Langdon. So
I can pick at it too. Yeah. Go ahead.
So yeah, so first of all, you can run containers on bare metal, right?
Sure,
You can run containers anywhere Linux runs,
Right.
or Windows if you're doing Windows containers. So I think it's actually the difference that I would call out between a traditional environment and a containerized environment is in two levels. And you're absolutely right about those three categories applying to both traditional architectures and containerized architectures. The difference is that in a traditional environment, you can more easily step into that environment and view the configuration.
Yeah.
In a running container, it's still a Linux process,
Right.
but that container image, that container image is not as, it's a little bit more opaque initially when it's deployed, and that running process, you can still step into it, but generally you don't generally, and so again there's that bit of opaqueness, and the tools had to evolve to address that. So these tools, these categories of tools, have been around for a long time. To your point. Right? Yeah. They've been used in traditional environments. They needed to be updated to be able to understand container images, container processes, and Kubernetes. And a lot of the original security tools, some of the perimeter tools, et cetera, they assumed that an application was running with a specific IP address, et cetera. It was stat in one place. Containers, if they're being managed by Kubernetes, they're moving around. You don't know what host they're deployed on. They don't have static IP addresses. And so the security principles for traditional and containerized apps are the same. The tooling had to be updated, and some of the approaches, like at the point in time at which you apply security or how you track security when you're not relying on an IP address, right? You need to, instead of using firewalls, et cetera, you use what some people call as cloud native firewalls or container native, but let's call it Kubernetes network policies. So you take a different approach. You're using the same principles, but you're thinking differently. So I'm not sure. It's more that we're so used to the traditional architecture that we kind of know how to step into that environment and debug. There's a learning curve that people are still on around containers and Kubernetes. And there's some elements about the amount of data that you wind up collecting, like if you're following an audit trail to debug or something, the amount of data and the context that you need to really pull on those threads in a container and Kubernetes environment, that's more complex for sure.
Yeah. I was also kind of getting at the thing that is hosting your environment is also significantly more complex. So there's a lot more opportunities for inadvertent failure because of poor config, right? It's kind of like the difference between running a Java application and running a Java application in an application server. Like you're still got the same problems, just that the volume of places where you can kind of screw up around your code kind of has gone up. I don't know. So I just think that and that's also for your typical developer, it's also not the kind of thing, I guess, languages, programming, whatever you're used to looking at, right? And so when you're looking at like deployment configs, if you are normally let's say a C developer, every day, looking at a deployment config, it's not your normal wheelhouse.
It's new.
It's new, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and infrequent. So even as you learn it, right, you have to kind of relearn it each time. So a little bit of a distinction without a difference.
So, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Langdon. Are you done?
Sure, fine.
Okay. I thought you were done. My bad. So, like, I remember walking into a startup that I worked at in 2015, And I ran some of these traditional tools against the repos. And then, this is just me coming in with my knowledge and saying, all right, we need to procure these tools and we need to use them. The second I started using them, the developers realized that everything's vulnerable and they have to completely change the way they develop things. Don't be surprised if you're new to this and you start running stuff that there's some like practices that have to change, and people will learn new things about like why their code is vulnerable. You need to be able to educate people as to the why behind that. So it's almost as hard learning the stuff as it is explaining it to others that they have to change some way they do things, or there's a new tool in the process that's going to start kicking back their PRs because something's wrong, right? So I also dropped a link in chat to our 97 things for cloud native environments. I can't remember the name of the book, to be honest with you, but I contributed to it, if that counts for anything. You can get it for free. It's 97 things every cloud engineer should know. We talk about containers in the book. There's a lot of, my friends that wrote part of the book, as well as some folks that have appeared on the channel, like Dr. Holly Cummings and Kirsten. I think you contributed to this book too. I forget. I don't know. But yes, that book will help you kind of get that high level overview of cloud native, security and your must haves for things that are out there in your environment.
And then, as you were saying, right, so we mentioned owasp.org earlier, right? There's some interesting information there. The Linux Foundation likely has some good content as well for kind of how do you learn about some of these things. Definitely looking for various places to get educated is useful. So
and it's important that you keep up with it too.
And like
it is very dynamic.
It is very dynamic.
Yep. You don't have to know every CVE that drops as much as you need to know like what are the new ways you can do a bad job of writing code, right? Or what are the new ways like and really if you start to see, I think what also helps is this is where the experience comes in too, is the more you see of like how things like the OWASP top 10 work, the more you'll start to kind of incorporate best practices kind of into your own coding style, where you'll second guess yourself when you start to say, well, maybe I shouldn't approach this problem this way, right?
Well, and here's a radical idea, right? Can you make friends with someone on your security team?
Right.
Bridging that divide is so important.
Yeah, exactly.
Some companies actually, and maybe not as many as need to, but some organizations really have started to embed somebody from the security team into the lines of business so that they can participate with the developers at the app dev team in the design process, in the development process, and collaborate. And honestly, this has to be a two-way street. The security team needs to learn some things too. In that, security, first of all, there's no such thing as 100% security. There's always some level of risk. And so you're really looking at balancing risk and business benefit and so you want to have a conversation. And frankly, because of some of the historical silos, security teams also haven't yet gotten necessarily up to speed on containers and Kubernetes. And they may not understand all of the business goals of the application that you're building. And so having a conversation that talks, where you kind of can go back and forth about why is security asking for ABC? And you as a developer can think about, well, is there an alternate way to meet that goal, right? You can still get to the use case. Maybe it's not in the way the security team originally thought. Like one of the things I do see a lot of, right, is there's a lot of, implementation practices or security guidelines that have evolved for traditional architectures. And they actually create some challenges for Kubernetes, but also for speed to delivery. So for example, It's funny when Langdon, when you were talking about the complexity, and Kubernetes is complex. It's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
But also when VMs first came into the world, right?
Yeah.
That was
That
a
was
new
hard.
type of complexity, right?
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
had to adjust for VMs.
And everybody has, right?
Right.
And the tools caught up,
Right.
And
Yeah.
have
Right.
simplified the experience.
Right. And so
Not actually simpler. Yeah.
absolutely. So we're on that same trajectory with containers and kube.
Mhm.
But so, so for example, a common process is like I'm deploying my app and I need to get a cert for my app from the corporate CA. And that's often I put in a request in ServiceNow and I wait and, I wait and I wait. And eventually I get a cert and I can deploy my app. So in a Kubernetes environment, again, because my containers might go down and be redeployed and they need that cert automatically, you really need to have an environment where that can be done in an automated fashion. And so to meet that use case, there are tools that are evolving in this space that help. But that's an example too where the use case of self-signed certs are bad, or it has to come from a corporate CA. Those are tied to particular architectures. Maybe that changes with a new architecture. And so you really kind of need to try to find a nice way to ask your security team, what's behind the requirement? What are they trying to accomplish? And then you as a developer can really help think about how to do that.
So I was going to make a comment that I think sounds a little tongue-in-cheek, but I really don't mean it that way. But this is kind of the argument, that we've made a couple times on the show in the past, is like behind diversity and inclusion in software, right? Is that we need to all share different perspectives, right? So in other words, it's a lot easier to learn about what's going on in the security world when I have lunch with a friend who does security stuff for a living, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot more fun too and tastier. And so if you get
assuming you're not eating the friend.
Well, exactly. We won't get into that part. But so kind of the idea of that the more perspectives we can incorporate into our software development and deployment and operations and testing, the more likely we are to not make stupid or easy or even hard mistakes, right? Like, and it might be a security mistake. It might be, it might be an interpretation mistake. I always go back to this, to the face recognition problems that they've been having because of who they're testing the face recognition on.
Yeah, the models they're building based off the data sets they have mainly skew a certain direction or another. Yeah.
Right. So, but the kind of the takeaway from that, right, is like, the more people that you kind of can interact with about kind of what you're working on and how you're working on it, and what, and to your point, like, what is the goal behind this rule? The better you will be as as an engineer or as an administrator, or even as a security person, right? Like, all of those different perspectives, you need to be not just living in your little world. You might know everything an OWASP has ever said, but that doesn't mean you necessarily, to your earlier point, understand the goals or the business goals of the application. And so you really need to try to incorporate as many perspectives as you can, and you will end up with better software. And I think that's a really important point that I think is highlighted by security in particular.
Yeah. And, honestly, it's an opportunity for security teams to learn as well. To your point about, YAML and Helm charts, these things not necessarily being things developers learn about, deployment, et cetera, that they learn about earlier. It's not their main focus. They're coding in Java or in whatever their main language might be. Security teams often haven't been asked to do much coding either.
No.
But YAML is a nice bridge in some ways. And again, there is this cultural aspect that I love your idea of lunch, because that's a way to just kind of create bridges, even if the organization hasn't yet been figured out how to do that. But I do know organizations who've asked their security teams to understand the pipeline, the application pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline, and the tools in them, and to start learning enough scripting, whether it's YAML or whatever is required, for them to be able to kind of understand how to implement some of the security gates in that pipeline. And that also means they understand more about the tools the development team relies on, and they can have a better conversation. But it's a challenge for sure. It's going to take time, right? People, process, technology, all of these things need to adjust.
Right. And one of the things, I mean, I often, I think I say this on the show, but I kind of talk about it in general. It's like, remember our industry is, just listen to Kirsten. Our industry is ridiculously young, right? And so not very long ago, right, as a developer, I needed to know how to pull a hard drive and replace it, right? Most people don't know how. Like, it was actually really funny. I was trying to upgrade the hard drive in my laptop to only discover I got the laptop open and it doesn't have a hard drive. It's has
soldered.
No, it's a whatever the
SS.
The new PCIe, PCIe. And so we have gotten very specialized. So we kind of were at a point where everybody had to know everything, which wasn't sustainable. And now we kind of went through the other end of the spectrum where everybody only knows their thing really, really well. And we're trying to find that happy medium of, okay, I know I'm an expert in my field and I know enough, or I know enough people, right? To be able to know, or be able to cover kind of all the other things in software development. And I think we're still working through that, and we may be for a long time.
Yeah, and I think, I'm thinking back to something you said right at the beginning, Langdon, where you're talking about SE Linux and needing to turn it off. And frankly, even a lot of people haven't heard of SE Linux, right? Security enhanced Linux. And in traditional architectures, a lot of admins turn it off because the custom apps or even the off-the-shelf apps that they deploy on their server don't understand how to work with SE Linux. So one of the advantages that a solution like OpenShift has is it understands how to work with SE Linux. So when you code your container images, they don't have to understand SE Linux.
Right.
OpenShift takes care of that for you. Right. But it calls out the need to really simplify, to assist developers with security. And this is another place where, open source can help, and Red Hat has been investing, right? Because there are a complex set of interactions between, like, some of these terms may not mean anything to our audience yet. Secure computing profiles, SecComp. Right. It's a Linux OS thing, right? C groups, SE Linux, all of these things that in Linux help to protect a running container process. But how do I work with those as a developer? Right. What do I need to know about those? How do I learn about those? And so one of the things, there's this open source project called UDICA. I never pronounce it, UDICA.
I've heard of it.
And it's all about giving developers a tool that they can use to create an SE Linux context to better protect their container image. So recognizing,
nice,
right, that it's not, and that's becoming, I think that's morphing into something called, there's an upstream container security operator. Again, trying to give developers tools that will assess their environment, their solution and what it needs, and provide recommendations on how to better secure it so that they don't have to get as deep in these different tools.
Storing
and sharing that one out.
Yeah, we'll definitely be looking at that one a number of times on this show. We've talked about, like, using volumes and colon little z and colon capital Z, and and what those different things mean, and how sometimes those things don't work actually across, like, NFS mounts and things like that. So SE Linux is something, when I'm using containers, I have to be a lot closer to than I have been on with SE Linux as a developer for quite some time. The really nice thing about how SE Linux in particular has gotten over the years is it really has faded into the background. It's just doing its thing, and it doesn't cause me problems anymore, right? Or if it does, I have this cool SE troubleshooter that pops up and says, go follow these things, and this is where, how you can fix the problem you're running into. So I really look forward to some of that, that stuff. Like I said, all that, I really like it when the kind of security, the basics at least, can fade into the background. Then I can just worry about my stupid mistakes, right? I don't have to worry about like the entire environment as well.
Exactly.
So should we pause here and talk about our sweet internet points?
I just asked the audience if they had any more questions for Kirsten, so I think now's a good time for let those roll in. Feel free to ask your questions before we sign off. We want to make sure you get those answered, but go ahead, Langdon.
And for Kirsten's sake,
what are sweet internet points?
We like to do a little thing on the show that we refer to as sweet internet points. And sweet internet points have no extrinsic value whatsoever, but they have the intrinsic value of you are awesome if you have gotten a lot of sweet internet points.
You too can be awesome.
You too can be awesome. And right now we have on our leaderboard, we have Narendev with 6,100 points, which is just a ridiculous amount of points. Yes. Followed closely, as always, by Netherland Hackham. They've gone back and forth a few times. Noah Friction, still, we have to go find out what happened to them, but they're pretty static at the 4,000, along with Joe Fuzz. However, if you notice, Detective Conan Kudo has actually surpassed Joe Fuzz with 2,400 points, and Bacon Fork tightly behind. And so we look forward to some more mixing up of the point scale. As always, there is the activities page on the episodes repo, which has kind of how you can earn points. But one of the ways is by entering this code that you see right here on the screen in an awesome, probably very secure Google form that has internet points. And I will cut and paste that into the link just to make your life easier.
So here's a good... Oh, go ahead. Finish up.
Yeah. I was just going to say, and so please enter your points, and you can also have cool or sweet internet points.
That may actually be worth something someday, like we've promised for
we know they're going to be
time.
So Kirsten, I think like most of us at Red Hat, you can attest to, we're actually pretty good at swag.
We are, yeah.
We are.
Except for this show.
Yeah.
It's
minus the show. Unfortunate. but so here's a good question from the same person, Jazz Corrette. Sorry if I say your name wrong. That prompted the question of what kind of tooling we need. Are there any playgrounds where people can practice that? Because there's a lot of tools that you could practice with, right?
Right.
I know we have our own playground on the Learn site. I know we have the developer sandbox, which folks is the URL for that and the QR code at the bottom of the screen. But I don't know if you can play with all the tools in those two places. I know you can play with a lot of them in those two places.
That's a really good question. I am not really sure that I have heard of such a thing.
I want to say, what is the company that is
GitLab?
backing OPA?
Oh, well, Styra is the company that backs OPA. OPA is Rego is the policy language. OPA Gatekeeper is an admission controller, right? We talked about security tools kind of for the CI process. We didn't really talk about some of the security tools that are available to gate deployments. And OPA Gatekeeper is one of those. But I'm wondering whether, whether a GitLab environment might be a place that you could play around.
That's a good point, because GitLab does have a free tier, which ties into another free tier for Kubernetes engine, I think, Google Kubernetes engine. Like, they have a partnership. So you could spin up a cluster and attach it with GitLab and really start hacking away at it. I'm looking at the Styra site, seeing if they have anything, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was just thinking, so certainly, you know, GitLab kind of, you know, has that whole concept of shift left, and has a lot of good information, kind of, if you just on their website. And at the same time, right, that's not the only set of tools you can use, but it could give you a good example of, and they do have integrations potentially with other solutions. So it might be an interesting place to play around.
Yeah. I mean,
it's actually, it's quite a good point, and
it is
somebody's could be working on, because I mean, I do know there are places where you can kind of play around with like SQL injection, right? You know, like where you can just kind of go try it out and see what it feels like, and you know, and have things do SQL injection tests against your site. So like it might be interesting to think about how can we,
has a playground.
build a security playground.
It is, and actually a DevOps or a DevSecOps kind of environment is something that some of us at Red Hat have been talking about. So yeah, maybe something will show up.
Yes.
You heard it here first.
Yes, exactly.
As we talk about a lot on the show, right? We are actually from the future, and so everything we talk about is
might be forward facing. Yeah.
right. Might be coming. But let's see. Were there any other questions?
No, not that I see. Feel free to ask. We're running up on time here, folks. We only have
what I was going to kind of say was maybe this is a good point to wrap up. Kirsten, is there any other, like, what's the single biggest takeaway as you know, I hate to use this term, but like, you know, an IC, right? An individual contributor, somebody who is not in control of the overall organization. What's the single biggest thing they can do to incorporate secure practices into their workflow or their work, as just, you know, somebody who is an employee at a company?
Yeah, so I think we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, but do your best to learn. I think check out owasp.org, check out the book that Chris, you mentioned earlier. And, you know, for anybody who's got time to try a playground, you know, I think the GitLab free trial would give you an idea of what it's like to incorporate all of these things. And actually, I really, Langdon, so you asked for one. I'm sorry, I don't have one.
It's okay.
Have lunch with your security, you know, get to know somebody in security.
I was going to say, actually, I was going to add to it. I was like, and don't forget, make friends.
Yeah, and those friends can be on Twitter. They could be on Instagram, wherever. Just make more friends in the space is the biggest thing. Yeah,
exactly. And just also by way of a little bit of context, we kind of gloss over DevOps on a pretty regular basis. If you aren't that familiar with DevOps, go read the fun little novel, The Phoenix Project, and you know, kind of learn from there. It's a fun little book. You know, it will be a good excuse to read something for work that is not boring.
So like The Phoenix Project, I do not like reading books because I don't have that long of an attention span, basically. But The Phoenix Project I picked up on Friday evening and was done by Sunday afternoon. Right? Like, that's how good it was.
It's really quite a good little novel. It's not
like a tech book. It is a real life, like, novel, like, of a fictitious environment where they're having lots of issues. And DevOps and the 3 ways of DevOps are explained in the book. And
there's a security guy. And so that will very much also play into this conversation about DevSecOps. And you know, I continue to wait for the next novel that is DevSecOps, or, you know, DevOps with quality assurance. You know, but I talked to what's his name? The guy, Kim,
Gene Kim.
I was like, Gordon? No, that's not the right word. I talked to him years ago actually about like doing some of those novels. I was really waiting for the follow-ups, but I continue to wait. So and he went off and has been doing other stuff.
Yeah, he did the Unicorn Project recently, which I have a copy of, but I haven't read yet. So
yeah.
Me and my books.
All right. Thank you so much for coming. We really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Yeah, you've given me a good blog post to write after this.
And remember, you can see kind of Kirsten talking about it from a slightly different perspective, and more about Shift Left and DevSecOps on In the Cloud in a couple of weeks on the 29th.
On 29th, yes.
And you should definitely check that out. Chris, what else do we have on the channel today?
Ooh, good question, Langdon. So coming up at 11 a.m. Eastern, 1500 UTC, we're going to be talking about the OpenShift assisted installer, which is one of my most favorite tools from Red Hat in the OpenShift world. It's actually how I spin up clusters routinely. When I break mine here at home, I use it to spin it back up again. And then later on, we're talking about DevSecOps again at noon. So a very DevSecOps kind of day, talking about protecting data in the actual OpenShift environments. So like data in the environment and everything else along with that. So that'll be a good show. And then I think we're off the rest of the afternoon because Lord knows I'm stacked up with meetings today. Like I'm literally from 8:45 until 5 p.m. I'm in meetings.
The channel is negatively impacted when people want to talk to us, basically.
I know, right? Like you invite me to a meeting that takes away from everybody else.
Right.
So, just remember that, Red Hatters. So yes, thank you very much, Kirsten. This was a wonderful
my pleasure.
conversation. And
thank you both.
I think the audience is thanking you as well. So you've done a fantastic job today. Thank you. Anything else, Langdon?
No, I think we're good. And we'll see you all next week. We're going to talk some more about security. And some of the buzzwords or words in the industry that you may not know, things like authentication and authorization and attestation, and what all those things mean and why you might care. And we hopefully are going to have a few people joining us for the show to explain the things that I don't know how to.
Yes, and there will also be a super special announcement next show.
Oh, yes.
And so tune in for that for sure. All right, folks, we will catch you here in about an hour. So take it easy, stay safe out there if I don't see you again. And thank you very much again to Kirsten and Langdon, the illustrious one as always. Bye.